with this, with the issue of interpretation. So we have simultaneous interpretation available. You can have a look. You will see the globe icon below. So there you can select the language in which you prefer to hear the panel. The important thing is not to forget to put the original sound of on mute, so you are not distracted with the sound of a simultaneous interpretation. And the other thing is, if you have any question, we ask you to type it where it says question and answers and not in the chat box, so it is easier for us to identify the questions. So I think that will be also, I'll give you the floor to the ambassador to introduce the event. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alessandra, and good morning for everybody. Well, for us as an embassy, it's a real pleasure for us to host this event to discuss autism, a condition that affects so many people in our country and yet is so poorly understood. We diplomats, we usually deals with very abstract issues, political conflicts. We always trying to promote commerce and invest flow in our bilateral relations or promote our national interest or our national brand. But with the exception of consular work, we generally don't deal with the suffering of our fellow citizens or families. I think a conversation like this, we will have a direct impact on the quality of life on the well-being of many families in Argentina. We believe as well we can profit in a way with the incredible experience of UK, one of the leading countries on the field. And I hope this will be a first step to develop a new chapter in our bilateral relationship. I think in this panel, we will discuss legislation on the autism spectrum with some of the key players in UK. Before introducing them, I would like to thank to the initiative and drive of Tomás and Lorena Loines, who are building an NGO in Argentina in order to bring people with autism or Asperger syndrome together. They took on the task of contacting each and every one of the people gathering here today, helping us to identify the main figures in the field here, and participated at every stage in the process of organizing this event. Our guests today are Mrs. Jane Asher, honorary member of the board of National Autistic Society, a leading institution here in the United Kingdom. Ms. David Tucker, president of the Asperger Foundation, an NGO dedicated to helping people with this condition, and an MP for Cambridge, Daniel Zeichner, who has led a large number of campaigns to expand the rights of people with autism. Lastly, with us today is Romina Donato of the Argentine Agency for Disability, who works on matters relating to autism and Asperger within the agency. The panel discussion will look at the UK Mental Health Act and its potential reform, and we will talk about how both institutions works, the Asperger Foundation and the National Autistic Society, and with the aim to identify lessons learned. I am sure with these speakers, we have a very representative people who deals and dedicated his life to this important matter. I am so very grateful to all the organizations that are attending this event, and I would like to give particular mention to Cynthia Fritz, Agustina Videla, and Horacio Jofre-Guivera, president of APADEA, the Argentine Association of Parents of Autistic Children. Each and every one of these individuals has devoted their lives to the matter. I would like also to make a special mention to Leonardo Gorbax and express my gratitude for his work, in particularly in drafting the Argentine Mental Health Act. He's joining us in this exchange. I would like to welcome him. I think I will give the floor to Lorena Loinas, who will, I think, chair this meeting. Thank you very much. And as I say, for me, it's a enormous pleasure to host this meeting. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días, damas y caballeros. Quiero en primer lugar decirles que es muy importante que estén hoy presentes para iniciar nuestra reunión, como también para todos los integrantes de la sociedad que represento y quienes han confiado esta hermosa misión. Gracias. Contamos con la presencia del embajador Javier Figueroa y la ministra Alessandra Viggiano, que hicieron posible que estemos acá. Nuestros expositores, Daniel Zeichner, Jane Asher the MP. Con todos los presentes que nos acompañan, gracias por estar con nosotros. La Sociedad de Autismo Argentina es una ONG en formación inspirada en la Sociedad de Autismo Británica, que es una de las principales organizaciones en el mundo a la cual consideramos referente. Somos un grupo de personas pertenecientes al espectro autista, conocidos de personas autistas o interesados en la temática. Entendemos al autismo como una condición y a los autistas como una minoría más cuyos derechos deben ser reconocidos y respetados. Como organización consideramos muy importante la discusión en el ámbito internacional, sabiendo que el 1% de la población y también Argentina pertenece al espectro autista, por lo que es vital contar con una legislación moderna. Por eso resulta interesante la discusión sobre la nueva ley de salud mental en el Reino Unido que tendremos con el diputado Zeichner. También es importante aprender de la Sociedad de Autismo Británica, ya que, si bien en Argentina existen otras organizaciones, no poseen la magnitud de la sociedad británica ni su capacidad de realizar actividades y políticas públicas. Desde nuestro espacio, queremos ver realizados nuestros objetivos que van desde la concientización de todo lo referente al autismo y el síndrome de Asperger, al asesoramiento científico, a la importancia de la no discriminación de las personas pertenecientes al aspecto autista, el pleno acceso a la salud, a la justicia, en particular combatir la criminalización del comportamiento autista, favorecer el desarrollo económico y la creación de oportunidades que comiencen con la plena escolaridad y formación que permitan su inserción laboral, entre otras preocupaciones que puedan surgir en pos de contribuir a la confección y o mejora de políticas públicas vinculadas directamente o indirectamente con dicha realidad. Los autistas somos una minoría, o por lo menos así lo entendemos nosotros, y nuestra lucha por la ampliación de derechos debe ser el norte de todas las sociedades. Les doy personalmente la y muchas gracias.
Very well. Thank you, Ambassador Figueroa. Thank you, Lorena. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Thomas Correns. I am a member of the Argentine Autistic Society. I will be playing the moderator. I will be moderating this debate alongside with my colleague, Rosalie Musso. Both Rosalie and I have been diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. But before, I would like to thank Ambassadors Vittorio Tassetti and Eduardo Swain from the Argentine Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Brett Hackett, Australia's Ambassador to Argentina, Brett Hackett, and Kirsty Hayes, the UK's Ambassador to Argentina, who are all of them, they are following this debate, so we thank them. Very well, let's move on to the interview with Daniel Zeichner, the Member of Parliament for Cambridge. Daniel, from deep inside my heart, I want to thank you for taking part in this event. Really, we can call you a friend at this point. So Rosalie will go ahead with the first question. Rosalie, please feel free to go ahead with her question.
Yes, what kind of impact is the ongoing pandemic producing on autistic people? How is the UK government dealing with it?
Well, good morning, Thomas, Ambassador, and everybody, and thank you for inviting me on this very important call. I'd probably give you a bit of a health warning first. Both Jane and Debbie are going to be far better placed to answer these questions than I am. I'm a politician. I'm not an expert, and let me start by paying tribute to both of them for the fantastic campaigning work that they do. I hope they'll agree with me that over the last decade, 20 years, we have seen a change in attitudes in the UK. And that is in no small part due to the fantastic work that has been done. We do have legislation in the UK. The 2009 Act was an important piece of legislation, but unfortunately, one of the problems we have is that our health service doesn't always have the resources to put the law into effect. And certainly the reason I found myself taking an interest in this issue was when I was elected in 2015, I had many constituents in Cambridge who felt that they, and it's often young people, they often felt their children didn't have the support that they both needed and wanted, but actually were legally entitled to. And that goes on being a big issue. It's different in different parts of the UK. You're right to say there have been reviews of mental health law. It's a slightly different issue in my view, and it may be we want to go into some detail on that. But I think the bigger question as to how people have been treated during the pandemic is a really interesting one, and one which I'm not sure is yet entirely clear, other than that to say there are a whole range of groups I think that have not always been properly thought about. I'm an opposition politician. I do not support the current government, but any government would have struggled last year with that sudden crisis. A year on, I think it's fair to say there has been time to think about that and to improve things. And the sense I'm getting is from, as I say, a number of groups, including those with autism, have felt that their needs are not always being properly safeguarded and catered for. But as I say, I think both Jane and Debbie would probably be much better positioned to comment on that. I'll just finally say that Parliament has a group of parliamentarians, the all-party group, which is supported by Jane's organisation, which campaigns on these issues. But frankly, Parliament has barely been functioning properly in the last year. Just about sits to hold legislation. I'm actually in Parliament this morning because I'm afraid in about half an hour I'm going to have to go into the chamber, so I may have to leave you before 1 o'clock. It depends how the business progresses. But normally, this Westminster is full of meetings and discussions with groups from outside Parliament. That hasn't been happening for the last year. And that's made it much more difficult, I think, for these issues to be raised. So even though we have lots of Zoom calls like you, and I'm sure representations are being made, I don't think it's as effective. And I don't think the so-called all-party groups, of which I'm a member, have been as effective either. So it's a complicated set of questions. I'll be very pleased to hear for myself, my own view, what Jane and Debbie's experience has been. But I hope that gives you some insight into the role that parliamentarians play.
Very well. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, we have drafted some questions for you, and then we were planning to turn to both Jane and Debbie.
You might do better to go to them earlier, frankly, because I think they're going to be better informed than I am.
Very well, very well. Let's do that then. Let's turn to Jane and Debbie. Please feel free to, well, introduce yourself. Jane, well, in your case, you don't need introduction. So what is the impact? What kind of impact is the ongoing pandemic producing on autistic people in Britain?
If I can answer first, like any condition that makes life more complex and harder to understand, I think the pandemic in that way has had a big effect, particularly on those people at the more severe end of the spectrum. As I'm sure all of us here know, autism is a very broad spectrum and covers those at the higher functioning end with Asperger syndrome, etc., right across to people, young people, adults with very severe autism. And of course, anything that makes the world even more confusing, even more impenetrable, and particularly what perhaps makes social interaction much, much harder is going to be particularly tough on people with this condition. For what the NAS is doing day to day that we've had to do over the last year, I think we should ask Jane Harris, who is also with us today. That was a confusion over that question from Jane. It was from the other Jane. Jane is our Director of External Affairs and knows far more about the day-to-day running of the Society and what we've been doing. Jane, if you're there, would you like to come in on this and just explain?
Sure.
Can I hear Jane?
Hello, I'm here. Can you hear me? Yes, good.
You actually labelled Jane Asher. This is very confusing.
How's that happened? I'm maybe the greatest day of my life, Jane. I don't know if that's happened.
Thank you.
So, to be honest, we faced really different challenges in the National Autistic Society. I think what we found is that people have been affected in really different ways. So people who maybe have sort of different day-to-day struggles, for who maybe are more likely to have an Asperger diagnosis, have more struggled with mental health, have struggled with social isolation, and particularly have struggled with getting sort of used to new rules. So when do people have to wear face masks? Do they have to wear a badge saying, I can't wear a face mask? All of that has been really, really difficult for those people. And we are seeing significant levels of loneliness among that group. So the level of loneliness among autistic people in general is now 7 times worse than the general population. So before the pandemic, it was 4 times worse, but that gap has got even bigger. I think for people who have maybe more complex needs, who need more sort of day-to-day support to do things like, get dressed, eat, go out of the house, the issue has been more about access to that support. So what do they do if one of their care workers develops COVID and they can't come into the house? How do they get therapy? A lot of children have not been getting things like speech therapy, occupational therapy. Sometimes there's been some experiments with things like teletherapy, but that just doesn't work for everybody. It really, really doesn't. And I think it's also been very confusing for some people if they've had care workers who've ended up, even if they can come, if they're wearing masks, if you're, an autistic person with a learning disability, and a third of autistic people also have a learning disability, it can be very difficult to understand, why is this changed? Why is this person suddenly in all of this clothing that I've never ever seen before? So in terms of what we've done at the National Autistic Society, we've really tried to, in our social care services and in our 7 schools, we've just tried to keep things going. So our schools haven't closed during the pandemic. That was the government policy in the UK, was that special schools should keep going. But it's been very, very difficult just making sure we've got enough staff. And there's been issues around, when do our staff wear PPE if the people they're supporting cannot understand, all of the new equipment that people are wearing? Also, how do we get tests to our staff? There's been those really, really practical issues. For sort of a wider group of people, we've done a lot of things, like we've produced really clear information, because the information has not been clear for autistic people on what their rights are, on what the restrictions are on them. There were some really welcome changes from government when it was said that autistic people could go out for exercise more than once a day, because if a routine is absolutely crucial to your life, changing that suddenly can cause extreme distress for somebody and can really put them at risk. But we've had to keep up with that. We've also done a lot of work to make sure the sort of social groups and the social activities we provide through our volunteers have moved online, but that's also taken a lot of work. In some ways it's been positive, because sometimes we've reached new people. So some people have come along to support groups online who've said they could never have travelled to one. Particularly some parents who've just said, I couldn't get childcare for my child to go out to an evening group to meet other parents of autistic people. That just wasn't possible. So there have been some positives of it, but I think that the real point is, autistic people have such a wide range of challenges, from mental health and employment to just trying to live safely and do daily activities safely. The adaptations we've had to make have been really, really varied.
Jane, we can't see you, by the way. Is your video?
Oh, that's annoying. I'm so sorry. Let me just try and... Sorry, our computers at work, because we have to abide to NHS guidelines, sometimes don't like Zoom very much. I'm pressing start video and it's not working. I'm very sorry.
Oh, shame.
There we go. Wait, no, I think I've done it.
It doesn't matter. We're able to follow you.
Oh, now you can see my garden.
Your camera is on there. Well, let's now turn for a moment to Romina Donato, who is from the Argentine Agency for the Disabled. Romina, por favor, el micrófono.
Buenos días. Desde la Agencia Nacional de Discapacidad de la República Argentina y en representación de su director ejecutivo, licenciado Fernando Galarraga, quien se disculpa por no poder estar presente hoy aquí, les manifestamos que es un gusto estar compartiendo este evento para abordar de forma conjunta entre el Reino Unido y la Argentina un tema tan esencial como es la salud pública y el autismo en sus diferentes dimensiones y alcances. Uno de los ejes transversales de gestión de la Agencia Nacional de Discapacidad, la agencia es el órgano del Estado rector en materia de discapacidad en la Argentina, es transversalizar la perspectiva de la discapacidad desde un enfoque social y de derechos humanos en todas las áreas que desarrollen políticas públicas. Consideramos que este es un elemento clave para fomentar cambios profundos en las políticas del Estado Nacional y así poder avanzar en la necesaria transformación cultural, en garantizar, restituir y consolidar derechos y en poder generar acciones que redunden directa y concretamente en la calidad de vida de las personas. Es en este marco que agradecemos la invitación a este evento, tanto a la Sociedad de Autismo Argentina como a Cancillería, y principalmente queremos agradecer al embajador Javier Figueroa, quien impulsó la participación de la agencia en este evento. Sin ánimo de extenderme, solo decirles que celebramos esta iniciativa desde la agencia, celebramos comenzar un intercambio fructuoso y seguramente una agenda de trabajo en conjunto. La Agencia Nacional de Discapacidad queda a entera disposición para continuar con este trabajo bilateral que se ha impulsado desde la Embajada. Así que muchas gracias y también decir que están presentes compañeros y compañeras de la Agencia Nacional para continuar con el intercambio y poder canalizar comentarios o inquietudes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Romina. Thank you very much, Romina. Very well. So now we got Debbie Tucker, the president of the Asperger Foundation. Debbie, it's a real pleasure to have you here with us. Well, same question for you. What, from your perspective, what kind of impact is the pandemic producing on autistic people there in Britain?
Well, I think Jane said most of it, but I'd like to endorse everything she said. But also just to explain that we are a very small charity, not in any way a competitor of the National Autistic Society. And I think it would be important to raise a discussion, not now because it would be a long discussion, but the reason that we're called the Asperger Syndrome Foundation is because 20 years ago, there was very little awareness of what autism actually was and Asperger's, and it was considered a separate condition. As some of you will be aware or might not, but I think it is important to raise the point that it's no longer on the diagnostic criteria. And we are, as a small charity, very aware of that. And it is now considered an autistic spectrum condition or disorder. The debate is still out there, but I just wanted to raise that so you knew that I was aware there is a difference and it does come under the umbrella of autism. So you might want to think about that when you're doing your literature on what is autism, what is Asperger's, etc. The only thing to add to what Jane said, I have run a helpline Monday to Friday. And the amount of calls during COVID have been at least double from quite some desperate individuals, but also from social services, because, as Jane said, the routine has been severely disrupted, and this can cause an anxiety of which, if you've never witnessed it, is really very painful and very distressing. And so we have moved our services online. We've been doing activities online, but also importantly, social services have reached out to the foundation to say, can you provide one-to-one from people who are not getting out, not seeing anybody at all. So it has been a crisis.
Thank you, Debbie. I would like now to move on to the debate about the mental health review there in Britain. Let me tell you that in 2010, Argentina passed a reform of its mental health. The author of that reform is following this debate, Mr. Leonardo Gorbach. He was a congressman at that time. Before that moment, it was a lot easier than now detain people with mental, to institutionalize people with mental health problems. So Mr. Goldbach, fortunately, introduced a bill to Parliament to make it much harder and to give rights, I mean, to people like us, in order that we can have access to the healthcare system, and that we are not, in case there are serious situations, that we are not detained so easily, and that we have access to the judiciary in a much more smooth and simple way. And well, as we all know, Britain is also on course to reform its mental health law. Initially, we had thought this as a question for Daniel Zeichner, who is an MP, but well, we can, you're free to answer it as well. So what is your opinion about this mental health care review? How do you see it, Daniel? And then when probably Jane and Debbie can expand on it.
Well, thank you, Thomas. And I'll be very interested to hear Jane and Debbie's view on this. It's a piece of legislation that's been a long time coming, quite frankly. The UK's mental health laws are actually quite out of date in many ways, it seems to many of us. There have been a series of reviews in recent times. The current government obviously has only been, and I say I'm not a supporter of the government, but on this I think there's quite a lot of cross-party agreement. The review, there was an independent review a year or two ago. It came up with a series of recommendations. The government's recently issued what in the UK Parliament is called a white paper, which is a discussion paper, and we would expect legislation to come through soon. But it has to be said that the entire government's legislative programme has been thrown off track, mainly by COVID, but it also has to be said by Brexit, which has dominated most of the time, and I suspect will continue to dominate quite a lot of time trying to clear up the problems that weren't resolved by the end of last year. So I think it's a reasonably progressive set of changes. I think it puts far more focus on users. I think it gives far more confidence to people that exactly as was detailed in the introduction by Jane, that when sometimes people don't necessarily understand other people's behaviour, there's a greater understanding now. That's not something necessarily to be alarmed about, but to understand and to act more sympathetically towards. So quite a lot of this is actually about making sure that people in public services, including the health service, I'm afraid to say, do have a level of understanding of people who are presenting to them. And that also involves quite a lot of training for medical staff, sometimes you would think should understand this, but don't always necessarily do so. So I'm hopeful that we will get improvements, but a lot will depend upon the resourcing to make sure that it can be implemented, because I say we do have legislation, but we don't always have the means to implement it effectively.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, Jane and Debbie, how do you see this reform? Do you think that it will truly bring Britain to the future in terms of mental health?
I don't know which Jane you're talking to, but I'll come in here, Thomas, if that's okay, and then maybe pass over to the other more knowledgeable day-to-day Jane. I'm very positive about it. I think it's quite exciting. Daniel briefly mentioned the Autism Act of 2009, and that took a lot of fighting for by the NAS. I have to say, this is something I think that a society concentrating on one type of condition can do, is to put all their energies into something like that affects a really important change. Obviously, the Mental Health Act is much, much broader. We were particularly dealing with autistic adults, but I think this one will generally help so many people across the board, including people with autism. Whether it's going to get everything we want, whether it's going to go through the dreaded Brexit, as Daniel said, is such a nightmare. But I think if it all goes through with most of it intact, it will be very good news for us as an autistic community. Jane, do you want to come in on this? Because this is very much your area too.
Sure. I think the interesting thing is that for years there's been a bit of a debate about whether autism is or isn't a mental health condition. And it feels like there's been quite a lot of work to try and establish for people that it isn't a mental health condition. The anomaly, though, in England, the current law is covering England and Wales, not Scotland or Northern Ireland. The anomaly is that is the piece of legislation that we use to detain someone if they're unsafe. So if an autistic people has really sort of distressed behaviour, if somebody's unsafe, in the middle of the night, they are detained in hospital under the Mental Health Act. even though most people would not think that autism is a mental health condition. You know, there's debates about, is it a disability, is it a difference, but most people would not say it's sort of a mental health illness or condition like that. So to be honest, the best thing in the Mental Health Act from our point of view is that it stops autistic people being detained for a long period. It would still allow somebody who's autistic, who's in a dangerous situation at 3 o'clock in the morning, to be held for 28 days, because that could be, you know, just an emergency situation. What do you do? You know, if particularly somebody's family or their care staff are saying we cannot cope, you know, that allows that. What it stops is that person being detained for longer than that. So that is really good news, because we've had a big problem in the UK with autistic people ending up in mental health units for years and years and years. I think the average, if somebody goes into some unit, is about 3 to 6 years. And we know that a hospital environment is very, very damaging for most autistic people. You know, all the things you don't want if you're autistic, lots of change, different people coming in, you know, environments with loud noises, bright lights, they're all the things that you need to avoid if you're autistic, or at least have some kind of plan around, and you cannot have that in most inpatient environments. And we've ended up with people secluded. There was one young girl called Bethany, it was a really famous case. She ended up being fed through a hatch in a door. She was basically in solitary confinement. She hadn't committed a crime, but she was in a hospital. I think she was there for 2 or 3 years, and it was absolutely
and her family not even allowed to visit her.
Absolutely.
You know, they did everything. It's just terrible, absolutely terrible.
It's been absolutely tragic and horrendous and really shameful. Like, that shouldn't be happening in any country today. So that is really positive, that the law will make it less easy for somebody to end up in that situation. The two things that I think though need to come alongside that is social care funding, because actually the reason people often end up in those institutions is they haven't been given the right community care in the communities. They haven't been given the right housing, you know, the right kind of care staff around them. So, and the problem, part of the issue is the money for the hospitals is in the NHS. And while there's not enough money in the NHS, it's been more protected in the last 10 years in terms of spending than local councils. And the money for care in the community is in local councils. So we need that, until that sort of disparity between council funding and NHS funding is really resolved, probably this situation won't be as fixed as we want it to be. It will be improved, but it won't be fully fixed. The other thing is that some people, and again, this sort of goes back to you know, autistic people having very different needs. There are some people, there's another famous case of someone called Alexis Quinn. She basically ended up in one of those institutions. She actually escaped and went to Egypt. I mean, it's a fantastic story. I really recommend reading her book. It's almost like reading a murder mystery or something. It's mind-blowing what happened to her. But she basically ended up there because she asked for some mental health support after she had a child and after her brother died. And those two experiences in her life were so life-changing, and she could not process them. She says what she needed was some counselling and some occupational therapy, you know, which would have cost a couple of £1,000 probably if she got the right package. Instead, she ended up, I think again, it was about 5 or 6 years she was in an institution, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of pounds per year. So I think those are the two things that have to go with the law: is the social care funding in councils and then mental health support that is tailored for autistic people.
Thank you, Jane. Let me tell you that when you were making your intervention, I thought about one of our members of our organization, who is a trans boy. Well, he has also been detained several times in the streets just because of behaving, let's say, in an awkward way, in a not normal way, which is, well, our normality. So I think it's important that we address this issue and that we have legislation to make sure that being autistic is not a crime. And as I said to Jane in the email exchanges that we had, we believe that discrimination is the one that should be punished severely. We need to change perspectives and address this question from a totally new approach. We must take a totally new approach over this. That's why it's critically important that we have this debate. Allow me to make a tiny clarification in case Just texted me. I made a mistake when I introduced her. She's among the attendees. She's the designated ambassador to Argentina. She's not the ambassador. She's not the current ambassador. She will be taking up the post in a couple of months. So she asked me to make this clarification. So let's go ahead. Well, Rosalie will be asking the next question regarding jobs and how hard it is for people to get a job. Rosalie, please feel free to go ahead. Your microphone is off.
Yes, I would like to ask about one of the key aspects of the Mental Health Act review consists of proposing a new way of handling supposed crime committed by autistic people.
No, sorry. We decided to skip that question. There's a mistake there. Well, if not, because they already answered that question of crimes. So let me tell you how the system works here in Argentina. Here in Argentina, there is not a certificate of autism. There is a certificate of disability. So Rosalie and I, we're both disabled, let's say, for the law. And that, well, enables you to get a job at the public sector. There are certain jobs, certain positions which are spared for disabled people. Well, then unfortunately in the practice, it's not like that. I mean, that quota is not always respected, but we would like to know whether there are any government programs in the UK in order to aid autistic people get a job. I don't know, Daniel, whether you can answer that, or you want to pass the ball to Jane and Debbie.
Well, thanks, Thomas. There's quite a lot of thought going on about actually how job creation is improved, because we know that because of the COVID crisis, we're facing a big unemployment set of issues. So there's a whole debate going on around how in general we can boost employment. And some of that, I'm pleased to say, I think is looking at how we can make sure the workplace is accessible to everybody, because we know full well that particularly people on the autistic spectrum, perfectly capable of doing jobs, in some cases are exceptionally talented and able to do very specific jobs, but it does sometimes require employers to make the kind of adjustments to make the workplace environment friendly for them. So I'm hopeful that there will be thought given to that, but it constantly needs to be argued for, frankly, because it's often seen as an afterthought and not part of the mainstream challenge. But I think what we're beginning to understand in the UK is that if we don't use the full talent of our workforce right across, then we're going to be missing out economically. And that's quite a powerful argument. It reminds people in the Treasury that actually is an economic case for doing this, as well as a social justice case, which is obviously extremely important. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go in a minute, Thomas, so apologies for that. I have the screen on in the background, and it takes me 10 minutes to get to the chamber from here. So thank you very much for inviting me this morning. It's been a pleasure to hear from others, and wish you very well in your work and future progress in Argentina, and I shall follow it closely.
Thank you, Daniel. It has been a big pleasure, and well, we'll keep on inviting you. You know that I am very insistent, very persistent. So good luck there in Parliament, and really it has been a pleasure to count with your presence here.
Yeah, Daniel, a personal thanks from me for all you do for people with autism. It's wonderful to have your support. Thank you very much.
There are plenty of people doing a lot of work, so thank you, and thank you for all that you do. Thank you. Cheerio.
Can I do a quick answer, Tomas, on the employment question?
Yeah, it's critical that we address that issue. I mean, unemployment of autistic people here in Argentina is also very high. I mean, we really struggle to get a job, and we also get jobs. We most of the time get jobs which are not well paid. So please, let's put the emphasis on this question, which from my perspective is crucial.
You see, my feeling is the fact that you have a certificate of disability, which I would hate you being called disabled anyway. That's just a personal thing. I would rather you go and get a job because you would be the best person for that job. And clearly you would be for many, many jobs. And there are so many people out there with autism who are not getting work, who are more than capable, as Daniel was saying, who have special qualities that they can bring to a position, whether it's being very good at a routine, whether it's being very good at doing the same thing over and over again without getting bored as a neurotypical might, whether it's just having that different way of looking at things, which can bring a completely new insight. I'd rather that most people with autism get that job because they deserve it, rather than because I'm disabled, I get this job. We've conducted some very big campaigns at the NAS about employment. It's one of the most important issues that we're still facing. We've made quite a big difference, but it's not enough, and there's a long way to go. Where we do convince employers that they will benefit from looking at the autistic community, it's extremely successful. But I think what you have to bear in mind is if you are trying to conduct any kind of campaign, You don't just have to help the person with autism to know how to do an interview, to know how to put across the things that the non-autistic employer will understand and will want to know about, but also you have to, in a way, train the employer as well. It's kind of getting the two sides to meet, getting the employer to make far more awareness of a different way of thinking, and equally the person with autism, getting them to understand some of the strange questions they will be asked. I mean, I remember there was one interview with an extremely capable young man, but he sat down and the interviewer said, "Now, tell me all about yourself." And of course, that was such an open-ended question, and the young man with autism was off. He started with his birth, then he went on to his schooling and so on, without knowing the way that a neurotypical would understand, I will give you the relevant information. That's a tiny example, but we need to have a different way of thinking by the employer as well as the person with autism. And it's crazy. I mean, there's such a huge pool of brilliant people who are not getting work that it's a very important issue.
Yeah, sure. I agree with you on that. I believe that we have lots of capabilities. We have an enormous potential that truly needs to be exploited. But the truth is that there is also a great deal of discrimination, at least here in Argentina. So probably combining both things is a key forward. But let's turn to Romina Donato a little bit. Perhaps he would like, because her agency is the one that deals with all this this process of incorporating disabled people to the state. Romina, quería preguntarte sobre, bueno, el cupo de discapacidad, cómo son las gestiones últimamente la agencia.
Primero quisiera aclarar que la Agencia Nacional de Discapacidad es un organismo del Estado Nacional y no del sector civil. También comentarles el trabajo que estamos desarrollando en la Argentina. La Argentina tiene, tal como dijo Jan, tiene el certificado único de discapacidad, que es una política pública, que la adquisición de ese certificado no es que etiqueta a la persona como persona discapacitada. De hecho, desde la Argentina trabajamos desde el modelo social y entendemos que la discapacidad es una condición solamente de la persona, y hablamos de persona con discapacidad o en situación de discapacidad, y dicho certificado lo que garantiza es derechos. Las personas con discapacidad, a través de las políticas públicas y las acciones que el Estado argentino brinda, les garantiza diferentes derechos. Tenemos también una ley donde el Estado debe cumplir los organismos del Estado deben cumplir el 4% de empleados con discapacidad dentro de sus organismos. Es una ley de avanzada. Sí es cierto que este porcentaje aún no se cumple y estamos trabajando fuertemente para que esto así sea. Es cierto que también la gestión anterior, la gestión de Estado anterior, este porcentaje lo ha disminuido y hoy tanto la agencia como todas las políticas del Estado argentino están trabajando para que este porcentaje crezca y crezca de una manera genuina, y además que las personas con autismo que puedan incluirse en los puestos laborales sea realmente una inclusión genuina, que realmente sean aptos para esa labor que deben realizar. Es decir, que estén dadas las condiciones laborales de adaptabilidad para que las personas puedan ejercer y desempeñarse en sus puestos de trabajo, y no a la inversa. No, es decir, no incluir a las personas o tomar a las personas simplemente por cumplir un cupo y quedarnos en una variable cuantitativa, sino que realmente hacer un salto cuantitativo. Estas son las políticas del Estado argentino que estamos implementando y trabajando fuertemente, articulando con todos los organismos del Estado. El Ministerio de Trabajo de la Nación Argentina tiene sus programas también destinados a proporcionar empleos a las personas con discapacidad. Quería comentarles esto desde el organismo de la Agencia Nacional de Discapacidad.
Thank you, Romina. It's also a pleasure to have you here with us. Well, now we got a question from, well, I mentioned this member who is a trans boy. He has the help of a dog who assists him. And well, we want to deal with this question of animals which are used to help autistic people. So Rosalie, please go ahead with the next question now. Microphone is.
Yes, we want to talk about animals because here in Argentina there is a debate about whether animals should be used to aid people with autism, with some people arguing it represents a form of cruelty. What is the legal status of animals in the UK regarding the possibility of using them to help disabled people?
What a very interesting question.
Yes.
I mean, somebody may know about this. I don't. Certainly, we use guide dogs for the blind as an obvious example, have been used for many, many, many years. So I've no idea what the legal position is, but to my mind, the comfort and benefit to the person with autism would be way ahead of the welfare of the animal. I'm all for animal welfare, but you know, if it's going to help someone with autism, why assume that's going to involve cruelty? I don't understand that. Why would it be any different than anybody owning a pet? Is it because they're thinking that the person with autism is not capable of looking after an animal? I wonder what the thinking behind it is, Rosalie. Maybe you can explain that to us.
Your microphone is.
Yes, we have here in our group a member who has an animal who helped him to face his condition, and because of that, we are thinking that it's very important to treat them because we think that in our experience is very important to do it. Yes, so because of that we decided to include this question.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, I'm not speaking for you, Rosalie, but does that question come from perhaps some myths around the image of what somebody with Asperger's or autism is capable of, or things in the press that are reported in a very negative way about the condition?
No, the truth is that it is an initiative, I mean, from this member from our society. He has a severe form of autism, and well, he needs this dog to aid him in his daily life. So well, he asked us to ask this question, and well, we wanted to know whether animals are also used there in Britain. We thought it was a very interesting question to start with. So well, I believe that because you know there are some organizations which argue that it is a form of cruelty and that animals shouldn't be used to help disabled people. Well, it's an endless debate. It's not easy to reach a conclusion. So let's proceed. We have some interesting commentaries there in the chat. You got Adam Feinstein. He is making reference to Borges, an Argentine writer, and his book Lunes el Memorioso. Well, it's a very interesting anecdote. Thank you, Adam. Then we got some questions that were submitted to us beforehand from the public. Particularly to Jane, I mean, this is connected with the statistics. Are the numbers of autistic children and Asperger children on the rise in Britain?
I think I can answer that one because there's such a myth about that. And I would argue, and Jane Harris will come in with more detail, the numbers that we talk about are far, far greater than when I first got involved in autism over 40 years ago. But I would argue it's almost certainly because we're much better at picking it up at last, and because we count many, many more sub-conditions within the autistic spectrum. So we're finding more people with autism there are more people generally, of course, and the spectrum includes far more. I don't believe in any real terms there is a rise in autism as such. Maybe a very slight one, but I think people get a bit panicked and think there's something we're doing now that is causing autism more than it was. Jane will come in on this because I have to be very careful. My personal view is that is not the case. It's a case of picking it up and more people being counted as autistic.
Yeah, we share that perspective. Let me tell you that we held a very interesting conference with Tony Atwood, very well-known researcher from Australia. Well, he told us that unfortunately he wasn't going to be here. We also talked to Baron Cohen, and we shared their views in the sense that the problem is that autistic people were missed in the past.
Yeah.
In the sense, mostly women, I mean, were missed in the past. They were misdiagnosed. I was personally misdiagnosed. I got some kind of ridiculous diagnosis in the past. I will, let's say, omit that. I will not mention that. And we also got a doctor working with us whose name is Victor Ruggeri. Well, he's a very important researcher at the Buenos Aires Hospital of Children. And well, he believes that. I mean, he believes that we had to put the emphasis on diagnosing children at the very beginning. That's critical in order to ensure that they have proper care, that they have access to the proper education. But yes, well, the same person who asked this question also asked whether there is a connection with the food intake that we have, whether that develops autism. And well, that's probably also connected with that very silly myth of the vaccines that existed in the past. I mean, we need to set that aside and concentrate on what science is saying and try to work from a scientific perspective. So I hope that from our society we can develop this. You know, there are several organizations in Argentina which work with autism, but the truth is that we haven't made enough progress. I mean, people aren't being diagnosed. It's very difficult to get a job. So I really hope that that our society can build bonds with the NSA, with the National Autistic Society, and with Debbie also, in order to learn from your example and to start working in Argentina and make things change. That's exactly what we aim at doing. So I believe that we have reached the end. I don't know whether we have more questions from the public. Let's check that.
Sorry, Thomas. I have read because there are a lot of comments there. I have read some. I have read an interesting comment from Cynthia.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if you want to mention her because I follow her in the social network.
Top activist.
And I know that she's a person that is very keen with these issues, and I would like for you to pick up her comment, please. I have it here. If you want, I can read it.
Yeah. I'm having trouble accessing the chat. Let's see.
No, she says she's talking in general about the approaching of autism in Argentina, and I think this is a question for Romina. She says that it is necessary to take into account the spectrum from childhood to guarantee basic rights to people with autism and their families from the very beginning. I don't know, Romina, if you want to expand on that and to tell us about the children in Argentina and what the Andes is doing with that.
Así es, nosotros tenemos en Argentina desde el año 2006 la Ley Integral de los Derechos de Niñas, Niños y Adolescentes, lo cual viene en consonancia con la Convención de los Derechos de de las personas con discapacidad, y allí trabajamos fuertemente en la detección temprana del espectro autista, y hay varios programas del Estado argentino que atienden en edades tempranas las diferentes situaciones para poder trabajar tanto con los niños, niñas que presenten algún cuadro de autismo, como con sus familias. Se trabaja mucho desde Argentina, desde equipos interdisciplinarios. Se trabaja fuertemente también en todo lo que es la escolaridad. Nosotros tenemos dentro del sistema de educación argentina la modalidad de educación especial, y además la posibilidad, a través también de una ley de prestaciones, que una de esas prestaciones es el maestro de apoyo o maestro que se dedica a la integración de niños y niñas con discapacidad, y en eso también los niños y niñas que presentan el cuadro de autismo. En este caso se trabaja fuertemente como pareja pedagógica dentro de las escuelas, para que los niños puedan desarrollarse al igual que cualquier otro sujeto. Los consideramos siempre como sujetos de derecho, los consideramos siempre sujetos que deben poder desenvolverse lo más óptimo posible en sus trayectorias de vidas, y brindarles todas las oportunidades, al igual que se le brinda a cualquier niño o niña en el Estado argentino.
Thank you, Romina. And very well, we have reached the end, but I would like to ask one final question to both Jane and Debbie as a closing question. You know that there is a debate around the use of the term Asperger. Some organizations advocate for the elimination of this term. They say that autism is more inclusive. I believe that we should use both terms. I believe that would be the most inclusive. We have called ourselves the Autistic Society, but I believe that we should use both terms. I like to say that I prefer the term Asperger. So what's your opinion about that, Jane and Debbie? How do you see? I believe it's kind of a sterile and futile discussion that doesn't lead us anywhere. But anyway, as a closing question, I believe it's a smart one.
May I just quickly mention, as regards the last subject we were discussing, what might be very useful, perhaps to your organisation, is our Early Bird programme, which is specifically for parents of children who are suddenly diagnosed with autism, who don't know where to turn, or are completely at sea. It's a brilliant little programme that really helps parents to communicate with their child and understand what's going on. So I just mention that quickly. And there are other things, obviously, we can help with, the early diagnosis and so on. My personal view, Thomas, is that Asperger syndrome is an entity in its own right. I was rather sad that it was taken off the diagnostic manual, because it's very hard to put it into words, but I know when somebody is what I would call Asperger syndrome, or when somebody has high functioning autism, and they are slightly different to my mind after many, many years. I well remember the day when Uta Frith, who some of you may know of, came into the office probably in the very early 80s and talked about this extraordinary condition called Asperger syndrome. And at that stage, I think Hans Asperger was still alive. And it clicked. I knew what she meant. And ever since then, I believe that it is not exactly a separate condition, but very much a subset that should remain existing. And it is, of course, so completely different from severe autism, although there are traits common to both. It's a completely different thing. So I would like to keep, if I may, describing you as Asperger's rather than autistic. I'm very proud to do so. I think the Aspies, as we call them in England sometimes, are a wonderful community, and I'm very proud to know you, Thomas.
Thank you. It's also a pleasure to know you well. Debbie,
Yeah, well, very quickly, I know you're running out of time, so I would just endorse that, and that is why we hold on to the Asperger's Syndrome Foundation for those people who prefer. to be recognized as Asperger's, and that's why we've kept it, despite the controversy regarding the name Hans Asperger. However, I just wanted to say that for me, on a personal note, my son was diagnosed when he was 5.5, and so I've been dealing with Asperger's, autism, autistic spectrum disorder for the last 25 years, and the National Autistic Society, I believe, are affiliated with the Autism Education Trust, and they endorse a system, if you like, of a multidisciplinary approach. I know somebody's already mentioned that, but I truly believe that that approach, a good diagnosis, a good prognosis is the way to start. Otherwise, we're still going to have the problems that we have with autism and employment till we get that side of things right. And the Autistic Educational Trust do a great deal of work and resources for schools, and it's training teachers, the medical profession, social workers to, as Jane said, I'm very excited about the work they do, and we need to continue that.
Well, thank you very much. We want to, on behalf of the Argentine Autistic Society, want to thank you all for taking part in this event. It has been a great honor, and I hope that this is the beginning to build a cooperation between our organization and the National Autistic Society and the Asperger Foundation. So we'll be in touch there with Jane Asher and Shay Harris. It's easy to get confused. It has been a wonderful moment. We have had a wonderful moment together. You're all very special people. I mean, it's interesting and hard to devote our lives to helping people with Asperger and autism. So I say this at the personal level too. I don't know whether the ambassador wants to say something as a closing remark, and then the curtain falls. I mean, given that you're an actress, Jane, then we say it in that way.
Well, thank you very much, Tomas. I just only thank you, all the speakers. I'm very thankful for they share your views and opinions that are very valuable for us, and particularly to the public for the question that they table. And please count with us, with the embassy, as a channel or a bridge with the British counterpart to continue this dialogue. I am very keen to continue this dialogue with the British embassy as well. I know Christy High is present, and as we do in many other aspects of our bilateral relationship, we expect to work together on that. And thank you very much for your chairmanship of the meeting, Thomas. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope I did it well. I don't know.
You did.
I'm not going to judge myself. I am not that arrogant to judge myself.
I think you have a future on TV. I think you have a TV show.
I'm a diplomat, so I hope that I can follow your footsteps, Javier. And very well. You never know what the future has spared for us. So,
Tomas, by the way, our chief executive, Caroline Stevens, she's away on holiday, but she said she would love to be put in touch with you all.
Very well.
How well you can work together. So that would be good.
So thank you a lot, Jane, and it has been a pleasure to meet you all. Very well. So the curtain falls, and that's it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
James and Debbie. Thank you very much.
Yes.